Mirë se erdhët në Public Square, unë jam Ditmir Bushati. Studentët në Serbi kanë më shumë se 3 muaj që protestojnë, duke paralizuar jetën universitare dhe duke rrokur në të njëjtën kohë një mbështetje të madhe popullore. Një mbështetje pothuajse nga të gjitha grupet shoqërore, nga bota intelektuale, universitare, nga rrethet e ndryshme të profesionistëve dhe nga grupet e ndryshme të interesit. Studentët po kërkojnë që Serbia të ndryshojë. Studentët nuk po valvisin flamujt e Bashkimit Evropian në rrugë, edhe pse presidenti serb i akuzon ato si protestat ngjashme me revolucionet shumëgjyrshe që kanë ngjarë para disa vitesh në Ukrainë, në Gjeorgji apo në Moldavi. Studentët nga ana tjetër kanë zgjuar një frymë të madhe solidariteti, nga Ljubljana në Podgoricë, nga Zagrebi në Athinë. Bëhet fjalë për një ndryshim gjeneracional, për një ndryshim brezash. Ku po shkon Serbia? Ku po shkon rajoni? Cilat janë efektet e pritshme të kësaj proteste? A do të thehet kjo protestë në një lëvizje të gjerë politike për të shënuar fundin e një epoke të presidentit Vučić dhe fillimin e një epoke të re, apo në rajonin ton për herë të parë do të fillojmë të ëndrrojmë realisht për një rajon që bazohet në një jetë më demokratike, në një jetë më cilësore dhe ku liritë dhe dinjiteti njerëzor vijnë të parët. Për këto çështje, sot kam vendosur që të ftoj në Public Square Aleksandra Tomanić, një aktiviste civile në Serbi, e cila ka marrë pjesë që në protestat e 96-ës, 98 2000-shit dhe në protestat e tanishme, për të shpjeguar më mirë realitetin në Serbi dhe efektet e pritshme të kësaj valet protestave në rajonin tonë. Dear Alessandra, thank you very much for being in the Public Square.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Let me start by asking you the simplest question ever. Why are students protesting in Serbia for the last 3-4 months?
Well, the question is everything but simple, as you know yourself. There are two sides. First, there is this trigger, why now? And the sad trigger was the collapse of canopy of the railway station. Canopy is part of the roof of the railway station that fell down on 1st of November and killed 15 people. That was a big shock for the whole society because that train station has just been renovated and opened by highest politicians even twice last year, and then it killed 15 people. And when you see that we live in a country where we are building roads, we are building infrastructure, we are the big builders, and then you see how unsafe all that is, that leaves a high effect. People started coming together in despair, in tears. For Novi Sad, that was really huge. Novi Sad is not the same city as before 1st of November. So people came together to be quiet and silent and to commemorate for 15 minutes for these 15 lives that were lost. The regime didn't have anything else to do but to come up with people who will attack and beat these citizens that were standing in silence. So in Novi Sad, a student of the Faculty of Arts was detained. And also in solidarity with him, the students of the Faculty of Art in Belgrade went out to commemorate and to demand that he's being released. And they were heavily attacked. And the Faculty of Arts in Belgrade was the first faculty that entered into a blockade and expressing certain demands. Then there was a time of around 10 days where you couldn't even count which faculty is blocked and which is not. It was really like so dynamic. But within a very brief period of time, we had the 4 universities of the countries completely blocked. And the latest number of faculties I read was 65. So basically, the whole higher education is standing still currently since almost 3 months. So the reason is this concrete tragedy of Novi Sad, which many don't even frame tragedy but murder, because its institutional failure is highest political corruption that led to this death. So the definition is unclear. So this was the trigger. But of course, it wouldn't be possible that everything lasts so long and grows so big if there wouldn't be much, much more behind the very trigger. As you know, we had here in Serbia big protests 2 years ago after 2 mass shootings, and like protests aren't anything new. So this discontent, captured state is something that we just say and don't really even go into further defining what it means. But when a captured state is becoming dangerous for your physical life, that is changing perceptions and things. And this is what we are seeing currently in Serbia.
So, from what I understand, the sources of discontent in Serbia are wider than the murder or the tragedy of Novi Sad. But correct me if I'm wrong. Following Serbia from Albania, although you don't seem to have a strong political competition in the political landscape, you have quite a solid civil society sector, and this solidarity coming from universities, but also from other layers of the society. I've seen also high school students, teachers, professionals coming from various walks of life that were part of the protests, or they were expressing their solidarity with the students. And this is what we see on one side. And on the other side, we have seen President Vučić asking for dialogue, but at the same time also organizing anti-protest or anti-rallies, something which we have seen, unfortunately, also in the past, in the similar cases in Serbia. So what is really going on right now?
Well, it's true what you mentioned, this huge solidarity. What we see now is much more than a students' protest. It was initiated by students, but literally the whole society followed. The always so badly targeted pensioners that are always seen as pro-government, for whichever government there is, they are out in the streets with the students. Then you mentioned it rightly, high schools, a lot of high schools across the countries are also blocked. And then the government just decided to put the winter break 1 week earlier. So students went in resistance to school instead of keeping up to the to the school break that was there. We have lawyers joining. We had a general strike at the end of January, where a lot of economic parts were standing still. We see a protest of the public transportation companies. So this wave of uprising, it's still growing. So we still haven't reached its peak, and that's very interesting. What's also interesting is that this dialogue narrative now, students have put up 4 concrete demands. One is we want to see the documentation about the renovation of the railway station in Novi Sad, because the documentation is state secret, because it was an intergovernmental contract between the Serbian and the Chinese government, because it was done by the Chinese and then subcontracted to dozens of companies. So that's the first demand, open the documentation. When you look closer into that demand, you will find yourself a bit puzzled, because in any democratic country with rule of law, that demand would have come from the prosecution office an hour after the collapse, right? Mm-hmm. And here we have a whole country having to take the streets for this demand, because it's not coming from where it's supposed to come. The second demand, we have seen a lot of arrests and attacks arrests, especially in Novi Sad. A lot of people, a lot of citizens, a lot of activists have been arrested. And across the country, a lot of people have been attacked. And there we also see something very indicative. So people who are protesting and taking their still valid civic rights to the streets are being arrested and attacked and prosecuted. And people who are attacking these are not. So the two demands go into this direction. So release those that are detained or are being prosecuted for living out their democratic rights, and do prosecute those that are attacking citizens on the street. And the fourth demand is regarding the budget for higher education. So the demands are clear. Calling for dialogue is just diversified, like it's trying to relativize it, because the demands are first not to any politician. Of course, everything is political if you want, but these demands are systemic and institutional. And that's why there is nothing to be discussed about them. And that's also the message coming from the students. We don't have anything to discuss. We put on paper what our demands are. And these demands, and I like how one student put it, these demands are our joint ideological platform. So we might be very different on a lot of things, but we are united regarding these four demands. And I think that this is very important. What is also very important that we see, and we've seen many protests, but the protests were previously in Belgrade, maybe in Novi Sad and Niš, so in bigger cities. Now, literally, protests have reached every village, and you can't even say when what is taking place. And sometimes you go in Belgrade and you go, I don't know, for a meeting, and then you end up in the middle of a protest that you didn't even know is taking place. So it's so decentralized now and so dynamic that it's impossible to count them, to map them, or to know where they are taking place, because neighborhoods are now getting organized. And it's very, very dynamic. And students are organizing big marches. They go by foot through Serbia. So they went from Belgrade to Novi Sad by foot, and were welcomed in each little village as liberators. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. So they're going through villages, when you look at election results, where the ruling party gets North Korean scores, and then these students come and they're being really welcomed like liberators. The whole country was marching on foot to Kragujevac for the Serbian Statehood Day. And that was also tremendous. And that is important for many reasons. It's much more than symbolism. It's in a captured media landscape important that they really get to the deepest of villages, to talk to people, that people see them, that people are aware what's happening in the country. And this is a new level of solidarity. And when you also look at the protest, you will see, and I think that is at this current stage so much more important than like the questions always being posed, what's the political outcome, what will that mean? We are seeing a society in tears. Everybody is crying out of emotion, out of, I don't know, 3 decades of living in survival mode, out of unprocessed trauma, out of all these fears that are deep down for many reasons. And what we see is a certain form of healing, of joint healing. And that is a change I think every of our societies need, but we see this currently in Serbia. And of course, this will also impact further political decisions. But what is currently taking place is this kind of healing.
You are a civil society activist and you are a very vocal person, because I have met lots of vocal and also sleepy, let's say, civil society activists, and this is everywhere in our region. And you were part of the protest since you were at school in '96, and later on you became part of the famous Otpor movements. So Serbia has a rich tradition of organizing protests, which makes Serbia quite different from the rest of the Western Balkans. what's your analysis right now? You are more mature, but I'm happy that you are still vocal. But what's your analysis comparing current protests with the previous ones? You spoke about tears, you spoke about heels, so you had some very good points in describing Serbia's society. And I was so happy that you did not mention the famous catchy phrase of internationals, stability. So you are focused on tears and on the heel. So what's your view? What's your take on that?
Well, a lot is different. First, like I was just calculating, I spent 2/3 of my life protesting against the same narratives, policies, people even, or if you want to put it positively, for the same values. So 2/3 of my life. And there are big differences. First, when you look back, Otpor, the students' resistance movement that then also helped get rid of Milosevic, was also a very heterogeneous movement. It lasted for almost 2 years, very actively. It forced back then the opposition to unite, but it also did what the students are doing today. It went out, it talked to people, it mobilized people, because we are fighting RTS, which is the state-controlled or should be, while it should be a public service broadcaster. And it's so sad to see that youngsters that weren't even planned back then, when we had like panels against RTS, are now having the same ones. So a bit, it's like a circle, like a vicious circle. We somehow don't manage to escape. So back then there was an opposition, and back then there was something to be united. I'm not going now into opposition bashing. I think it takes a lot of courage to be politically active as an opposition politician currently in Serbia, because back then the opposition had the backing of the international community in terms of security and many other things. Now there is none. And that's one big difference. So back then we knew that we were seen and that we were supported. Today, there is no international backing. I mean, I think we still have to digest altogether what this new US administration will mean for all of us. The EU is very silent or very diplomatic. The EU itself has said 2018 that across the region state capture is prevalent and has done nothing to follow up, not regionally, not individually. Instead, stabilocracy or stability before democracy, as you mentioned. 25 years ago, you could see EU flags in the streets on these protests, because those protests from back then in the 90s can be more compared to the protests currently going on in other countries like Georgia, or as we've seen in Ukraine. There was more this geopolitical moment. Today, it's purely internal politics. The protests currently happening in Serbia has nothing to do with geopolitics. And you will not see an EU flag because the EU has disappointed those that were the biggest fans of it here. Too many things last too long. They're backing the people that are actually against EU values. And the lighthouse, that symbol of a lighthouse that the EU had here in the 90s, has been lost over the decade. So this is a very big difference. And again, even in the 90s, we didn't have this really protests being literally everywhere. There were some centers, and Otpor tried to be really present and so on, but this really public outcry that like people on the streets literally everywhere. There are people that are mapping now where protests are taking place everywhere. And this is new. We didn't have that back then.
You rightly pointed out the fact that students and people in the streets are not waving the EU flag, something which we've seen in the case of Ukraine Georgia, Moldova, but also immediately after the fall of communism in our region. Then why President Vučić is speaking about color revolution?
Well, he has to discreditize somehow what's going on. And then colored revolution, that's the fear. He also uses the narratives also from 30 years ago, which he also shaped as he was the information minister under Milosevic in the last years. Also the narrative that foreign secret services are behind that, and that everybody who speaks freely is paid for it. And now the whole US aid thing, well, guess what? The biggest receiver of US aid money was the government of Serbia. So he has different narratives for his voters, for his media, and for international partners. So that's nothing new. And it's basically even getting boring because we are listening to these kind of narratives since 30 years. Okay, the colored revolution as a term is new, but has nothing to do with what we face in the streets.
What's your opinion? What's your analysis about the role of international community during the last period? Not specifically focusing on their reaction on the protest, because I've seen their reaction, and it's I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, when you read the letter of the President Macron or the letter of the Enlargement Commissioner Kos, or the reactions coming from the German Foreign Ministry, I mean, there is no coordinated approach on how to deal with Serbia, and this might be my quick takeaway. What's yours?
Well, if you want us to go back 10 years ago, we have a crisis of the enlargement policy. And the enlargement policy was the biggest soft tool and the biggest transformation tool the EU was so proud of. And then it somehow gave up on it, because enlargement policy is more than opening chapters or rearranging them to clusters or whatsoever. It's about the political criteria, it's about the economic criteria, it's about the political leverage. And this has been given up. It went gradually. First was Commissioner Hahn, who was more into infrastructure, and there all this transactionalism actually started to get in. Then it was about stability. Then the EU actually didn't want new members because they didn't know how to deal with them. And now everybody speaks about this renewed momentum, but I'm missing two things. For the Western Balkans, we would need to see working groups on absorption capacity on the institutional level. What does that mean? 6 new commissioners, 6 new seats in council, and so on. Because everything else is like we are so small and so poor, there is no absorption capacity problem. And for Ukraine, which is now the new geopolitical tantrum, we would need to see 2 working groups. One, what would that be for an impact on the budget? Ukraine will be among the 5 biggest member states if it joins, and on the common agricultural policy. And none of this is happening while everybody tries to convince us, no, enlargement is back on track. So if you lose this leverage, and if you start playing around and then you do that, what happened to North Macedonia, and of course the other countries see that. So what's then the point? And we unfortunately don't have politicians in this region who would like to reform their societies and set up institutions and become, I don't know, Norway or Switzerland. And then see, once the EU is ready, we will be ready too. So here you always needed this kind of stick and carrot game. And that was somehow lost on the way. So I think that this is the biggest problem. And then, of course, other players come in. I mean, for too long, people said like, oh, the end of history. Yes, great. No, there is no end of history. It was always geopolitics here. And then when everybody found out that geopolitics was actually never gone, then the surprise was big. Everybody is speaking about Chinese investments in this region. Well, surprise, let's discuss Chinese investments in Germany, in Greece, and in many other EU member states. So I think that it's measured with different measurements. And the competitive advantage that the EU had, and that was this value-based thing, has been lost on the fault of the EU side, I'm scared to say.
It's difficult to complain about geopolitics, and there is nothing wrong in my view about geopolitics. But what I see, especially in the case of Serbia, but also in the Western Balkans, is this kind of geopolitical coexistence among key international actors. Don't you think that there is this geopolitical coexistence somehow, that they are all somehow being served in Serbia or in our region?
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with you. When you look into Serbia alone and then deduct from there why certain member states and then also EU institutions are so silent. Serbia had elections in December 23, which are internationally documented as fraud elections and heavily manipulated. The European Parliament had a very tough in wording resolution on these elections or on this election fraud in February 24. Nothing happened. None of the other EU institutions took up on that resolution. No member state took up on that resolution. What happened instead? 3 months after or 4, the German Chancellor was here with with a caretaker commissioner to sign an MOU on the lithium deal. Just 2 weeks after that visit, President Macron came to sell his fighter jets. So everybody has their interest here. As I said, this transactionalism is in pure place. Serbia has not introduced sanctions on Russia, but is selling weapons to Ukraine. So everybody feels fine with that. And then you find your way around it, and everybody is happy. And then you have citizens that are like, well, no, we are actually not happy. And then you're accusing citizens for wanting a different country to live in. And then you're like, wow, wait, what? And then you have to rethink everything what you actually believed in regarding actors of the past 3 decades.
Alessandra, I was reading on Twitter Branko Milanovic, a famous Serbian-American economist and a good friend of mine. And I will quote him or his short analysis on Serbia. He was saying the problem that Vučić has is the following. In Serbia, as in many countries, parties are entirely clientelistic, not programmatic organizations. Members are there basically to steal. Now, the head of the party cannot easily tell them, I'm going to punish you for stealing, because until yesterday, he was encouraging them to steal. In communist parties, which were hierarchical and programmatic, sudden policy shifts were acceptable. One day membership is told Hitler is the enemy, the next day membership is told Hitler is a friend. No problem. They follow orders and they know that the party knows best. Tactics can change, the aim is the same. But in parties that are totally devoid of any ideology, you cannot do these shifts, because their only ideology is economic gain, known also as stealing. Period. So my straightforward question to you is, can President Vučić deliver?
Well, just one comment on that tweet. I don't agree that the Communist Party said one day Hitler is a friend and the other is an enemy, because the Communist Party was very clearly anti-fascist, so I wouldn't really leave it there. Another example might have been fit better. No, the good thing about these demands is that they seem so simple, but that they're so smart. So if they get, especially that first demand, open the documentation, everything what was described in this tweet, it will fall down, because all the corruption, all the clientelism, where did the money go, why institutions were not delivering, all that will be publicly there and will lead to a certain collapse, if not full collapse. So this is a very simple but very tricky demand. On the other hand, if that demand is not fulfilled, as I said, we still have a rising protest movement. We still haven't reached the peak. So the end is open and we don't know where it will lead us. So it's for I think that for the president, this is a lose-lose situation. But again, I think we have to think in longer terms here. The two, you mentioned them earlier, contra protests were held in two little towns, in Jagodina and in Sremski Karlovci. So you need only a few thousand people to fill the space that it looks wow. And this is already one indicator that it's obviously not possible any longer to fill big squares. So you go into little town. Second, we see that through all these movements across Serbia, people start thinking and somehow realizing things, which is very important if you look into how closed media is, and that for more than 10 years you didn't have an open debate or an exchange of views on any national television. The dialogue that they refuse, the dialogue is important also for another reason. According to the institution, the role of the president is pure protocolary. But somehow the whole political sphere and the whole society plays along with him capturing more power than provided by the constitution. And also all internationals play along with this constitutional break. They come to visit the president who has nothing to say. Nobody goes to see the prime minister. We have even the prime minister who resigned a few weeks ago and nobody even notices. So you don't notice a difference. Is he there? Is that what's happening? It's not a topic at all. And what have students done? With two words, they have somehow, like they said, the king is naked, because it was that simple. They said, you are not in charge. I mean, it's more words in English, obviously. So you are not in charge. Why are you addressing us? Why are you inviting us for dialogue? Who are you? You are not in charge. And this is huge. This is so huge and so brave and yet so simple. So, I think that this is a very interesting phase we are currently in this protest, and that we will see where it will lead us, but that it's very important on so many levels, and that the political level or the political outcome is just one of them.
And my last question is, where is Serbia heading to? I was watching a graduation ceremony in the University of Padova, and one of the students there had a beautiful speech, and she was referring to the students of Serbia, to the protests that they are doing the last 3-4 months, as a source of inspiration. So when I ask you where is Serbia heading to, I want to know your opinion also whether you would foresee a spillover effect in the region. We have seen solidarity actions from students of Croatia, of Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, but are we at that stage of starting to envisioning a better future, a more decent future, a more normal political, economic, and social life in our countries? What's your take? What's your forecast?
Well, I'm not really famous for my optimism, but actually here I am optimistic. I think it's great what we witness in Serbia currently. I think it speaks a lot, and it's so important that we have this regional solidarity with the students from Ljubljana throughout Croatia and Bosnia up to Montenegro and even North Macedonia in our still post-war and not yet peace region. This is so crucial. It shows that the whole region is longing for healing and for a new generation and for more togetherness, and we see also across the world that the Serbian diaspora is, and then it's very sad to see where there are people from here instead of being here. We had in Greece, in Thessaloniki, in Athens it was, a huge protest, but not by Serbian diaspora, but by Greek student counterparts. It was thousands that recognized this. I think it's also a generational thing. I think that this generation has understood that the division line between us and them is not with your neighbor. It's about certain structures that are not healthy and us. And I think that this is something that the young generation globally can recognize themselves, but definitely in our region. So I think that this, if this is the only lesson that they leave after this protest, that will be already a lot. So I'm very optimistic. I'm very grateful for them that they're doing all this. I'm very sorry that my generation failed and that we have now to look full of hope into this young generation. And I really hope that all together we will finally manage to change something in the short or in the medium term.
Aleksandra, it was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.